Hello, welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly podcast of Catholic Studies Academy. This is Dr. Benjamin Smith sitting in for Jason Gale. Today I am joined by our lecturer in theology, Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli. Dr. Bulzacchelli is not only a theologian, but he also has a degree in philosophy. As such, he's interested in philosophical matters as well as theological matters. And I suppose in your fundamental theology class, when you've taught that in the past, you probably also dealt with some philosophy. Today, we're going to talk about the fourth way, which is probably the fourth way that Thomas Aquinas uses to prove the existence of God. That's probably one of the arguments for the existence of God that probably seems the weirdest, right, to most people. It's probably one of the ones that's not used very often in sort of an apologetic context. It's an interesting argument, and Dr. Bulzacchelli is going to explain to us how it works and why it's persuasive, and we'll discuss maybe its strengths and its weaknesses and some of the background that goes with it. Dr. Bulzacchelli, why don't you get us started here? Why are you into? What do you think about this sort of as a general argument? What's sort of, in your view, the provenance of this argument? Like, what's its general sort of background and approach? Well, how does it distinguish from the other arguments?
Well, okay, so I think if you look at the first and the second argument for God's existence in the Summa, mm-hmm. what you really see there is sort of an Aristotelian metaphysic, right?
Sure,
more or less.
Yeah.
And in the fourth way, though, so those arguments, right, the first and the second, those are the ones that everybody talks about all the time.
Sure.
And so here we are doing another podcast on Aquinas's arguments for God's existence, but we're not talking about those two arguments. And
right,
maybe there just isn't need at this moment for yet another podcast on those two arguments, but there will be in the future, of course, right? They never get old. But
sure.
But the fourth way, I think, is sort of undertreated.
Mm-hmm.
And today in particular, actually, I think mm-hmm. it's undertreated. It's pretty interesting. Its provenance isn't really Aristotelian as far as I can tell, but more Platonic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And, why do you say that?
Well, because I think that what it really comes down to is that judgments we make about the beauty or goodness or some sort of perfection of a thing in this world of limited beings, right,
mm-hmm.
is reference to something outside of the system.
Mm.
I think that's the way the argument actually works. And I've got, sort of two iterations of it in my mind, one of which may be more authentic to Thomas's mind, and one of which might just represent my own way of kind of thinking about it, inspired by him.
Okay.
But I think that in either case, right, it comes down to a very similar point,
mm-hmm.
that the reference against which we judge things as beautiful or true or good or just is not in the system of the world. It's not just other, it's not just relative to other things, right? But
mm-hmm.
but relative to something completely beyond the system.
That's interesting, the way you put it there. It does have the fact that you're talking about judgments we make and references to a standard outside the system, right? That does, like the way I teach the introduction to philosophy class, the way I would teach kind of Platonic forms, right?
Right.
Is in that way, right? Like I tend to push the idea that if we're going to have knowledge, right, then we need a logos, a standard,
mm-hmm.
That is universal and unchangeable, so that we can, like a universal and unchangeable definition of triangle, by which we can judge that there are triangles in this world, right? Or approximations to triangles, I guess, if we're Platonist. It is kind of interesting. I've gotten into this conversation before to think about metaphysics, that I wonder for Plato, I think for Plato, I'm becoming more convinced that for Plato, there aren't substances in the world of change, right? That is, that the only substances are really the forms, right? And that everything else is kind of like, flux,
Mhm.
right? And just has accidental aggregation, which may approximate the world of the forms, right?
Uh,
But isn't. No, that's not what Thomas is saying exactly. So sorry for the rabbit trail there, but I think that it's interesting. It does sound Platonic, right? If you're thinking about it in terms of how we make judgments about the good or the beautiful, right? So if our judgments about the good or the beautiful ultimately depend on or presuppose, is that what way we like to put it? Something outside the system that is, I guess, good in itself, beautiful in itself. Was that correct?
yeah. So I think, I think if I think that St. Thomas probably isn't thinking that at a conscious level where we're sort of referencing that thing outside the system.
Sure.
But I think that he's saying, let me put it in contemporary terms, right? If he were to do a phenomenological analysis of such judgments,
Mm-hmm.
he would discover, right, that there's something going on in the formation of those judgments that can't be accounted for simply by reference to other members of a class.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah,
But maybe we should read the argument, and then we can.
That sounds good. I'll read here. Just going with the standard old English Dominican fathers here. So I'll read through it, and then you can comment for us. Dr. Bulzacchelli. So here we go. The fourth way of proving the existence of God is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings, there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated of different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter according as it more nearly resembles that which is the hottest. So that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as is written in Metaphysics 2. Now, the maximum in any genus, this is probably the key premise here. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection. And this we call God.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's an interesting argument.
Right.
First, let's criticize, maybe some aspects of his metaphysics, right?
Okay.
That, today we might regard as sort of passé, right? So he says he mentions fire, right? As fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. Well, he's kind of presupposing an elemental structure of reality, right? In which fire is one of the elements and it's the cause of hot things. Today, we don't accept that view, right? But I don't think the argument stands or falls on that point.
No, yeah, I think it's
right. I just want to get that out of the way, because obviously I think one of the things that people do with Aquinas' arguments is they take some cheap shots at biology that we no longer accept, or
right.
or these kinds of this sort of metaphysic, or actually not metaphysic, it's really a physic that he's talking about.
Right.
That we no longer accept, and so we don't have to listen to anything he has to say. Really, he's throwing that in as sort of an illustration, right?
That's right.
Make a point.
Yeah. I don't think it's meant to be a substantial premise. It's an illustration, just like you said. Yeah. And an illustration can be false without the principle being false.
Right. So the question is principle correct? And I think I want to defend it. I think that his principle is correct.
Okay.
And if you think about it, just think about your experience, say, of observing beauty in the world, or goodness, or something like that, right? So if we notice that like we apply the term beauty to many different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that when we apply the word beauty to these many different things, we're applying it equivocally.
Okay.
I don't, right? So I don't think that the beauty of a piece of music and the beauty of a woman and the beauty of a painting are equivocally, right? I don't think they're completely different things.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Sure.
Um,
Although
on
they
the
seem
other,
quite different, right? I mean, the
they,
beauty of a woman, like in a lot of ways, would seem quite different than the beauty of, say, a piece of music.
yeah, they seem very different. Um, but I think that the reason that the word is meaningful to us in both in all those cases, right,
Right, right, right.
is that we recognize some kind of similarity. So I would say that while they may not be univocal, they're certainly analogous,
Okay, good. Yeah, sure.
right?
Yeah.
They're not equivocal.
Thomas would like that.
Yeah, they're not equivocal, right? They're
Fra Thomas would nod. Yes,
uh-huh,
yes.
yeah, they're analogous to each other.
Uh-huh.
All right. Um, and now let's look inside. So now you got three different classes of beings, right? That I just mentioned, right? A
Sure.
woman, a painting, a piece of music.
You could add nature too if you
And
wanted.
you could add a sunset. I mean, the list could
Yeah.
go on,
Sure,
right? We could
sure,
make it
sure.
as long as we want.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and then when you look at members within any given class, right, you could also compare them to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think that for many people, the argument breaks down because they think that, we're talking about you could have a salt shaker with more salt or less salt. And then you could have a salt shaker with a maximum amount of salt. But that doesn't imply that there's, saltness, right? That doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really imply that. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
imply that there's this thing that's most salty, and
Right.
it's the cause of all the salt and the other things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think they're making a mistake. I don't think that's actually what Aquinas is arguing.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about more or less salt, we're really kind of talking about quantity.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
when
Sure.
he's talking about these other things, he's kind of talking about qualities,
That's interesting.
right?
Yeah.
Perfections. Okay.
Maybe like maybe intensity.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So like, it's maybe that's not right either, but something like that seems correct because like you say, it's not just like increments, right? Like this one is, I don't know what would be a measure of beauty, but let's say, you had this one's three more units better in beauty, right?
Uh,
Than everything else. Well, that's not exactly what Aquinas is getting at,
yeah.
right?
I don't think that's what he's saying. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So in our experience of reality, right, we can look at more than one member of a class
Mm-hmm.
and we could recognize it as being the most beautiful that a member of that class could be.
Mm-hmm.
And we could see that this is the interesting part, right? And this is why I say when earlier I said if Aquinas does a sort of a phenomenological analysis of the experience of making judgments about things,
Mm-hmm.
he's seeing that something more is going on than meets the eye, right?
Yeah.
So I think that if we look at this experience, right, we see that we can make this kind of judgment about more than one member of the same class,
Mm-hmm.
even though the members of those individual members don't necessarily resemble one another very much.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there's some sort of being able to say beauty of both a woman and a sunset
Uh-huh.
sort of presupposes some kind of maybe not univocal, but primary sense of beauty,
Uh-huh.
right? That transcends either of the subjects you're predicating or describing, right?
Yeah.
Because those two, I guess, is this kind of what you're thinking? Because those two subjects are so different, right?
Uh-huh.
Like their similarity is really in relationship to some third
That's right.
rather than to each other. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, but I'm saying that Aquinas is making this point both about objects between classes and objects within classes,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
right? So, for example, you could imagine two different sunsets.
Sure. Sure.
Each one, when you look at either one, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're bowled over by it. You're like, I
Mm-hmm.
can't imagine sunset being more beautiful than that.
Uh-huh.
But if you could sort of see both of them next to each other, you would notice that they are in fact different.
Mm-hmm.
They don't
Mm-hmm.
just they're not identical sunsets, right? They're different.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And so if in each case we only have a couple of options here, right? If in each
Yeah.
case you said this is as beautiful as a sunset can be, you must either have been mistaken in one instance,
Uh-huh.
or or both instances, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you are mistaken in neither instance, and the reference against which you're judging the beauty of the sunset is not sunsets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You see what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
So also with women or pieces of music or paintings or
Mm-hmm.
anything else, right? That we might
Mm-hmm.
we might encounter in the world.
Yeah. 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 That's interesting. So, um, how do we get from that seems to me a sort of a logical or an epistemological point you're
Uh-huh.
making, right? Um, I've got a couple of questions about this, but um, how would you deal with a kind of maybe a little bit of a nominalist pushback, right? What if I said, okay, Rich, really what you're talking about are something like what Wittgenstein calls family resemblances,
Uh-huh.
right? So, yeah, they're these two sunsets we're comparing, or these two pieces of music, they're not exactly the same. Say you're comparing Bach and Brahms, right? So maybe they're not exactly the same, but they're similar enough, right? They have enough overlapping properties, right?
Uh-huh.
That we can recognize that they overlap with other pieces of music that we call beautiful and other things that we call beautiful, maybe not in a univocal way, but not in an equivocal way either. That whole framework is problematic. What we should just talk about is there's enough resemblance that we can enough overlap that we can intelligently talk about beauty without talking about a genus or a species that is beauty.
Yeah. So I guess I might have a couple of reactions to that view. One, I don't think that is an account, I guess is
Yeah.
what that's my first critique, because I don't think that's an account.
Mm-hmm.
Um it's a theory, about relations between objects purely abstractly constructed. It does not it doesn't deal with the data that's most important in this question, which is the fact that we recognize something, that we experience it as
Mm-hmm.
beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in other words, I guess this is in some ways sort of if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound question.
Sure, sure.
Right. When we make a judgment that something is beautiful, we're making a judgment that involves the reaction of the subject to an object.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, sure.
I don't want to say that it's a purely subjective thing.
Okay.
What I want to say is that this object is the type that elicits this kind of response in this subject.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, sure.
And I think that we actually can discover that certain objects elicit similar responses in a wide range of subjects.
Yeah, especially you do obviously human subjects, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you're suggesting here reminds me, and we don't have to go down this trail too far, but this reminds me of what you're saying. C.S. Lewis in the little book,
Abolition of Man.
Yeah, Abolition of Man has a great little opening where he talks about, different ways of thinking about the beauty or of a waterfall, or
Yeah,
whether it's
right.
sublime or not, right? And he says, a modern way of looking at this would be to say, when I say that the waterfall is beautiful, I'm really just expressing my feelings about the waterfall and nothing else, right?
Yeah.
And he says an older way of looking at it is to say, I have these feelings about the waterfall because it has certain qualities, namely that it's sublime and beautiful. Right?
Yeah, right.
Right. That this object does elicit in me a certain set of feelings, to be sure, but it's the object that does it. It's not that I just project onto it some description or some evaluation or some set of feelings, but it's actually it's a response, right? I love the description. It helped me a lot when I'm trying to understand Aristotle, when somebody described to me that sensible qualities are like keys that open the powers, right? Of the sensible powers, right? They're such, our powers, our capacities are such that when they're confronted with, when they encounter sensible qualities, they're actualized, right? Like a key unlocking a lock, so that's I take it that's a correct way of describing your view about the I guess that beauty or goodness or whatever we want to talk about is actually in the things, not just sort of
in the eye of the beholder.
In the eye of the beholder.
Yeah. I do tend to think that. Now, obviously, right? Obviously, there's a great deal to be said about subjective responses to various things, right?
Sure.
People do perceive things in different ways, and some people are moved more by one object than another, but I still think that we can see in sort of an aggregate observation of human responses to various objects that there's a great deal of universality.
Okay.
Right. And I think that those, what we are talking about are qualities in things and how they then relate to subjects.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, that's a good response. I mean, we could keep going on that, but that's
so. I mean, again, my point
in
response to him is simply that that he's an account is something that has to. When I say that, do you have an account of this? What I mean is do you have a way of explaining why X, Y, and Z in my observation would be the case, right?
Yeah.
And I think what this nominalist critique provides, it just doesn't answer one of my central questions.
Gotcha.
Right.
I understand. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, I was having a conversation with maybe several weeks ago with Mr. Grossheim about who's been on this podcast before, about metaphysics. And I thought, one of the things is that the belief that there are real essences, right? That's actually, that thesis, I should say, that's actually probably among the most important, right? Metaphysical theses. It sounds kind of boring at first, but I really think that modern metaphysics just sort of presupposes nominalism. Like this, there's just a bunch of stuff out there. They sort of group together in accidental aggregates, but really everybody's kind of an atomist, right? Like that there aren't, maybe it's a very sophisticated version of atomism, but really there aren't essences as a reality, right? In things. That seems to me to be like kind of just presupposed in an enormous number of metaphysical issues, and as well as more cultural issues.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Okay, great. So my second thought here is, how do we get, so you're making some, and this isn't in the argument, you're making some epistemological points with some, that has some metaphysical presuppositions. How do we get from epistemology to being, right? You follow me? Like I get, Plato likes to make this move from, this has to be the case for there to be knowledge and truth, There is knowledge and truth. Therefore, there is this being, right? This, you know, sort of transcendent world of forms. Is that what you see Thomas doing, or do you see Thomas doing something different than that? Is it, how Platonic are we going here?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I don't think Thomas is a Platonist, strictly speaking.
Sure.
We know enough about his metaphysic overall, right, to say that
Mhm.
he's a hylomorphist. He sees real substances in the world.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that actually one of the things we don't appreciate sufficiently, either about Aristotle
Mm.
or about the Aristotelian metaphysicians of the Middle Ages,
Mhm.
is the extent to which Platonic thinking is actually an influence
Sure.
for
Yeah.
them, right?
Yeah.
So in
I
other words,
totally
when I
agree.
look at Plato and Aristotle, I don't see two people who are wildly apart from each other.
Okay.
What I see is people attempting to grapple with the same basic set of problems,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we look at the conflict between, say, like look at the tension between Heraclitus and Parmenides,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think this is really what the question comes down to for the establishment of these two main metaphysical trajectories. Okay.
Yeah. It is fascinating. I think you're totally right, Rich. It is fascinating. The longer I've studied philosophy, the more I've come to appreciate the pre-Socratics, and they're genius, even when they're wrong. They're
Right.
just,
Even when they're wrong,
they're
because
just
they're asking the
it's
right
just
questions.
genius, right? Yeah.
They're asking the
Yeah.
right questions, and those questions demand answers, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so here's Heraclitus. He looks out the window and he sees that things are changing all the time,
And he's right.
and he's right,
That's a good
right?
observation.
So I guess that means, right, there's no permanence. That's kind of his conclusion. Nothing's really permanent.
Right.
And then Parmenides is like, but that can't be,
Uh-huh.
right? That can't be. First of all,
Mm-hmm.
um, again, I'll project a more contemporary mindset on him, maybe, but he would be like, you look out the window and there's a tree out in front of your yard, right? In your front yard, and in the winter it loses its leaves, and in the
Right.
spring it
Yeah.
grows them back.
Yeah.
You don't perceive this as two different trees. You perceive it as one tree.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And moreover, you don't think it's not a tree the next day.
Yeah, you don't
Right.
think it's not a tree the next day.
Like it became a rabbit, right?
Yeah.
It's still a tree, right?
Right. So basically he's saying, look, the only thing that can account for being is being,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's change that's the illusion.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
Yeah. That's brilliant.
And the thing is, you can't neither. It seems clear to me that neither of these two responses can possibly be correct. And yet
Uh-huh.
the question that the question to which each of these responses is a response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is an obvious question that has to be asked and answered.
Sure. And to go back to what you said, something you said earlier, it is an account, right? Like you can see why, like how you would think that way. It is a logos, right? You can give an explanation. When I teach metaphysics, very often I spend at least a week on Parmenides and just hammer away at the idea that, of course, change has to be an illusion. And I try to pitch it that way to kind of provoke the students into really thinking about being, right? And that strange phrase from Aristotle, we have to think about being as being, right? And then that really, it's just, man, it's hard to wrap your head around. It should be hard, right?
Yeah.
And both Heraclitus and Parmenides answer, give an account that's interesting and has some force behind it, at least. And then you think about both Plato and Aristotle, right? Plato says yes and no, right? He says, yes, there is permanence in the forms. And I'm these days, I'm pretty persuaded that he thinks that the world of change is just a Heraclitean flux, right? It's just, this passing.
I agree.
Veil,
I agree. Actually, that's the way I see him too. I see him as saying that our world
mm-hmm.
is Heraclitean flux,
except
that there's a link made from the world of forms to it
mm-hmm.
that gives it shape. right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
sort of imposes a kind of dependability on it
That's
that doesn't
true.
belong to it in its own.
Properly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's, you know, almost kind of makes you feel sorry for the was it the demiurge
Uh-huh.
in the Timaeus, right? Because
Uh-huh.
he's trying to like
He's
patch
got so
everything
much work to do.
together. Right? Exactly. Yeah. He's trying to, you know, create this kind of order. That's a whole nother. We should do a podcast just on the Timaeus sometime. But
Yeah.
anyways, and then Aristotle, you know, Aristotle wants to kind of split the difference too. He splits the difference between Heraclitus and Parmenides a different way, right?
Right.
He wants to say, the way I try to put to my students is that within the world of change, there is some permanent structures or patterns, right,
Uh-huh.
that are unchanging. So it's not that it's not that there's an individual sort of unit within the world of change that never changes, but the pattern, right, never changes
Uh-huh.
within the world of change. And of course, then there's the unmoved mover, but that's outside of the world change. So yeah, I think, yeah, you know, they're addressing similar questions, coming up with some different answers. But yeah, there's still all sort of, there is a unity of consideration there, right? Now, we were talking about that in terms of Plato and Aquinas. So, what do you want to say with
All right. So I want
respect
to say
to
that for Aquinas,
Aquinas? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
there's a more robust Platonic element than one finds in Aristotle, I think.
Okay. I think so.
All right. So, and of course, you want to keep in mind, right, that until Thomas's time, I mean, during his lifetime, right, it was
Mm-hmm.
still the case that the church's preferred metaphysical approach to things was Platonic,
Sure.
right,
Sure.
Neoplatonic.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you know, you want to put him in his historical context
Sure.
and see what kind of influences there must have been on his mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the case, right? That he's kind of looking at the concept of God as essentially doing the work that doing the work that Plato's World of Forms does,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And also the work of the demiurge, right?
Yeah.
So
Sure. Sure.
God is clearly more than a demiurge for
Yes.
Thomas, right?
Yeah. Of
But
course.
but basically his providential care over the universe keeps
Mm-hmm.
everything in order, right?
Mm-hmm.
He establishes the natural law, he executes the natural law, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's the account of the permanence of things,
Okay. Okay.
right? And that's basically what this argument is saying, right? He's
Yeah.
essentially the account of the permanence of things. So we and also the next argument, the fifth way from the government of
Sure.
the
Sure.
world,
Sure.
right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So Rich, though, how do we still kind of wondering though about moving from epistemology to an ontological
yeah. So I guess
conclusion?
the question would be, well, does our knowledge require an account? And I think the answer to that is yes,
Sure, of course.
right? So I seem to know something. I seem to have these concepts of beauty and goodness and truth. Well, they could be illusions, but we don't experience them as illusions. And
Yeah.
I think there's enough phenomenologists in Thomas to see that if my mind is so constituted as to form certain kinds of judgments, that it's probably the case that there's something about reality that causes that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah. I mean, when I defend realism, I tend to argue in that direction. You know, like if we we think being because there is being, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't think at all.
Right. Well, what you have is the odd thing is, right, you have an intellect that seeks for an account. I mean, I guess you might be able to hold this view, but I give up the fight at that point. I mean, I don't know where to go with this.
Sure, I think
You know,
dialectically you can't though.
yeah,
I think you end up in a self-refuting kind of
I have a
position.
mind that forms these kinds of judgments,
Mhm.
that thinks these sorts of things, that recognizes the concept of truth. Um, and yet it doesn't correlate with anything in reality. It's just a complete sort of mental illusion.
Right, right,
Uh,
right. In which case you're making truth claims and you're right. You're kind of defeating yourself.
I have a
Right.
mind that demands accounts of things,
Right.
and there's no account for that kind of a mind. Or
right. Sure, sure. Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't seem to work well. So if we can make these kind of predications, then that presupposes a highest standard, and then we want to draw the inference, make the inference that, or Thomas wants to seem to make the inference that, therefore there must be, this thing must exist and be the cause of these things, because he does use causal language there. So can you kind of explain that inference a little bit?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. In what sense does it cause these things?
Okay.
Well, Thomas, for Thomas, there are 4 causes that he accepts.
Sure.
For many medievals, right, there's a 5th cause. And Thomas doesn't speak of it, but I think he's employing it here.
Okay.
All right. So even though he's not recognizing it, usually it's not in his system of causes. I do think he implicitly accepts it. All right. And that is the exemplary cause.
Gotcha.
All right.
Does
so
he not speak of that somewhere? I thought he did. Maybe I'm wrong.
When he outlines his 4 causes, when he outlines the causes, he doesn't talk. He doesn't list it as a true cause, right?
Interesting. Okay.
But to me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about it, but I do think that's the case. That's always how I've understood him. But to me, I think the exemplary cause is a real cause, and I think it appears as such actually in the Gospel of John, right? The very idea of the Logos is among other things, it's an exemplary cause, right? It's the inner logic of God by which he patterns the world. God doesn't have some pattern of things on which he could model the structure of the universe, other than himself, right? Other than his own mind.
Right. There's nothing prior to God, right?
Right. There's nothing prior to God, right? And nothing prior. There's nothing that isn't, let's put it this way. There's nothing that isn't God that's prior to creation.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So
good point.
So he's got nothing to work with but himself.
Yeah. That's a great point. It's very important, actually.
And so here's what Bonaventure is saying, right? Thomas's contemporary. That essentially God leaves his vestigiae, right? His footprints, fingerprints, his marks on everything that he creates. Everything that creates is in some way patterned on his own existence. And so if you look closely enough, if you have eyes to see it, you can perceive something about the truth of God in things.
Right.
And I think that's basically what this argument is.
That's interesting. That's a really interesting interpretation, Rich. I don't think I've heard several different interpretations of the 4th way. The 4th way is always good for a conference paper. If anybody's a philosophy student out there and you're looking for a good subject matter for a conference paper, the 4th way is always a good one, right? There's lots of different kind of interpretations. I don't know that I've heard or read about it. Maybe as an exemplar, maybe Henley talks about that, but that's a very interesting account, that this is about exemplar causality, right? I'm not sure that I 100% agree, but I think it's a very good interpretation, very interesting interpretation.
How would you
the premise that's weird to me, that seems so interesting to me, and maybe weird, so I don't know, is this: now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, right? That's like kind of like a premise that Thomas drops from time to time, right? As if it's just oh, this is obvious, right?
And you wonder, is it obvious?
Right, exactly. And then weirdly, it seems for him to use that premise in this argument seems to kind of contradict his own metaphysics.
It does, because
God's not in a genus.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah, and so I'm like, and neither is being is not in, so I'm like, I don't know exactly how this is going to work.
Yeah,
It
I
seems
think
a little
he's saying
weird.
it
Yeah.
analogously though.
Okay.
I mean, look,
You see the problem I'm having with that.
I totally get it. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I saw that too.
Mhm.
I yeah, because he explicitly addresses the question.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, like if you're a major, a philosophy major, and you're in a Catholic college, one thing you know about Aquinas, right, is that being is analogous, right? The being is not. I mean,
In
if
fact,
you know anything, right, about Thomas, you should know that, right?
One of the major debates between the Scotistic and Thomistic
That's
school
right.
is
Exactly.
over this question, right?
That's right. That's right. Right.
So I think he has to be sort of using it in an analogous. He has to be saying that analogously.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So if that's the case, then it seems to me there's something about the idea of the maximum is the perfect.
Yeah.
And the perfect is that which has whatever we're talking about in itself. And as such, it's the efficient cause of everything that is below it, right? That is, it distributes that quality of perfection that it has in itself, that everything else has by participation. So, I mean, there's a lot packed into thinking about it that way. And I'm not 100% sure that I'll concede. I'm in saying that I'm reading a lot into the premises of the argument. So I'm not sure that that's what Thomas intends. I do think have you ever read the oh gosh, what's it called? The Book of Causes by Thomas. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's an interesting book. If I remember correctly, it's commentary on Proclus, and which is, of course, then ends up being very Neoplatonic, right? And when I was in graduate school, I really enjoyed exploring that text and trying to understand participation, because Thomas does use that participation language, and it's, you're like, and whereas Aristotle is like, nah, I'm not doing any participation. And
no, but it's an important idea in Thomas, though.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you can find it all over the place, and it seemed to me, this goes back a ways in 20th century Thomism arguments. Cornelius Fabro has some interesting arguments about this interpretations, but it seems to me that participation for Thomas's understanding of participation ultimately involves efficient causality, even though it does involve perfect versus imperfect, right? So what I got from the De Libro, I think that's what it's usually referred to, is that something participates when it receives from another imperfectly that which belongs to another perfectly and in itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's what he thinks. Yeah, I think that's his view.
So maybe I would kind of lean towards this as a participation argument, but again, that's reading a lot into this very. I mean, these arguments are like. I mean, I look at the screen here; it's like they're like 5 lines long.
Yeah, they're pretty condensed.
So you kind of almost have to do some reading in. I mean, I guess with the first and second way, we have so much of Thomas talking about act and potency and motion that we can read in with a good bit of certainty, right? Like we can take one of those premises, like that every effect has a cause. Well, I can explain that pretty clearly because of what Thomas says in other places, about cause and effect and change, right? Which is mostly standard Aristotelian stuff. This one's just harder, but I appreciate your interpretation there. Exemplar causality. That's it's interesting. And maybe indeed that's what Thomas means. Just wrapping up here, having that read reminds me of a work by I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Gerson, who has a very interesting text called Aristotle and Other Platonists, which is meant to be a provocative title. Where he gives a very Neoplatonic read of Aristotle, actually, which was in the ancient world the majority report, right? The majority report before in the ancient world, post Aristotle, was that Aristotle and Plato are actually in harmony, right? And that, which is an interesting hypothesis, right? Because we tend to see them, more in disagreement, and this would, sort of be kind of going along with that. Actually, maybe this is a more Platonic style argument. One thing that would be, that would support that hypothesis, just as a historical context matter, is that Thomas, is very indebted to Ibn Sina or Avicenna. And Avicenna, is an Islamic philosopher, but is very Neoplatonic, right? Which Neoplatonism, really blends Aristotle and Plotinus together. And I think I can see a lot of Plotinus in there in Aquinas, to be honest. And so I think that's just a historical context kind of piece that would be in favor of your interpretation. Do you have any last comments you want to make before we wrap up here, Rich?
Well, yeah. So I think the one thing I would want to say, and we could talk about this for hours more, I'm sure, but one of the things I want to say is that these arguments for God's existence, as you pointed out, they're very short. He gives 5 arguments. That's what makes the article seem longer, right? Is 5 arguments. But when you look at any given argument, it's very short, extremely condensed.
Right.
We have to understand what the purpose of the disputed question was in the Middle Ages, right? The Summa Theologiae is written on the model of a disputed question.
Yes.
And it was a teaching instrument. Right. The point of it is actually to generate conversation, to guide conversation, right, and to refine the conversation in seminary.
Sure.
Right. Yep. So the expectation, right, isn't that you just read the argument and okay, let's move on. You're going to talk about it for hours.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. That's an important observation, an important reminder, Rich. Thank you, Dr. Bulzacchelli, so much. This has been a fun conversation. This stuff is wonderful to explore and think about. And I'm sure that our listeners will have lots to think about going forward. Thanks so much, and everybody have a good day, and God bless. Until next time.